This is the trailer for Gladiator 2. And this is a follow-up trailer after the first one got dislike bombed. No doubt because they felt the need to use rap music. Taking the place of Commodus, we have the Paul brother lookalikes, Karla and Jitka, the co-emperors of Rome in 211 AD. Now, because this video pertains to their lives and times, encompassing the largest citizen grant in history, there may be spoilers up ahead, but only maybe, since we all know Ridley Scott's track record as far as history goes. History tells us that only the following year, Karla seizes power for himself and gives 30 million people Roman citizenship, basically everyone who didn't already have it. This was the culmination of a process going all the way back to Romulus and Remus, and it neatly marks a dividing line between the first and the second millennium of Roman history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The causes and effects of Karla's citizen grant are still debated to this day, so much so that cause and effect become almost indistinguishable. At the heart of the riddle lies a deceptively simple question. Of all the enlightened emperors that Rome had to offer, why is it Karla who takes such a seemingly progressive step? After all, this is the same emperor who's about to be the villain of a blockbuster Hollywood epic, the same one who Edward Gibbon calls the common enemy of mankind, and also the one who, as you might have guessed, murders his brother in a replay of Rome's founding legend. To get to the bottom of it all, we're gonna need the full story. Who was Karla really, and what kind of situation was he inheriting? What was the true state of the empire around this time, and how exactly was it affected when almost every single inhabitant suddenly became a citizen? Stick around and you'll not only get the answers to those questions, but also the story of a tyrant who gives Commodus, Nero, and Caligula a run for their money. As the curtain fell on the 2nd century AD, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, took its final bow. The 5 good emperors, as Machiavelli later dubbed them, had all left the stage, and their exit was encored by the disappointment of a generation. That disappointment bore the name Commodus. Though he was the son of the finest philosopher-emperor Rome ever produced, he preferred to be typecast as the reincarnation of Hercules. His assassination by a wrestling partner in 193 AD triggered the Year of 5 Emperors, when no fewer than 5 imperial contenders rushed to claim the vacant throne. A similar drama had unfolded way back in 69 AD, when Nero's suicide sparked the Year of 4 Emperors. It was then, as the great historian Tacitus put it, that the secret of empire was revealed. Rulers could be made in the provinces.
God, Tacitus, he just all killer, no filler with him. Did he ever have a bad quote?
That's what enabled a country bumpkin like Karla's father to claim the throne after he emerges victorious from the Year of 5 Emperors. His name was Septimius Severus, and he is described by the scholar William E. Dunstan as a bold and experienced general who acted with decision in the mold of Trajan and brooked no opposition. Like Trajan, and Hadrian too for that matter, Septimius hailed from the empire's periphery, from a Phoenician trade port 75 miles east of modern-day Tripoli in Libya. Though descended from a wealthy equestrian family, Septimius could not shake off his Punic accent, and it's been suggested that he pronounced his name, not unlike Sean Connery, as Septimius Severus. In a pretty desperate bid for legitimacy, Septimius had himself posthumously adopted by Marcus Aurelius, leading one sarcastic senator to congratulate him on finding a father. Today, Septimius is considered the founder of a new dynasty, the Severans, and his 18-year reign leaves us with a legacy just as multifaceted as his character. We'll get to his legacy by the end of this chapter. For now, we can discuss his reputation, a wholly different thing. Not only was Septimius an able general and administrator, he was, if not quite an intellectual, a very curious guy. He met with Galen, the foremost medical authority in the empire, and was applauded by him for his vast stock of medicines. He toured much of Egypt, hauling back cartloads of books, and visited the pyramid complex at Giza. According to the writer George C. Brauer, it was even more impressive back then because the pyramid's stone facing was still intact. Throughout his reign, Septimius was a great patron of doctors, jurists, poets, philosophers, and astrologers. Apparently, it was because of a favorable horoscope that he chose a woman named Julia Domna as his second wife. It probably helped her case that she was an exotic heiress, descended from a line of Syrian priest kings devoted to the sun god Elagabalus, a name that you might recognize. Julia will play an important part in our story, not only because she had beauty and brains, but also because she bore Septimius' two ill-starred sons, Karla and Jitka. These boys were only 1 year apart in age, with Karla being the elder. His name at birth was Lucius Septimius Bassianus, though, for reasons I'll soon explain, the nickname Karla is the one that stuck. Because of the brothers' mixed ancestry, it's safe to say that they bore little resemblance to their on-screen counterparts in Gladiator 2. Brauer describes them as good-looking, like their mother. But as the two grew up, Karla gained a reputation for usually looking quite stern and angry, whereas Jitka was always the modest, milder personality. As one story recounts, the two boys accompanied their father one day when he announced he would execute all the senators who supported his rival. In keeping with their historical roles, Jitka questioned why this was necessary, whereas Karla only egged his father on, suggesting he kill his enemy's children as well. Now, it could be that such a conversation never really took place, or that it was colored by subsequent events. But that seems all the more likely when we hear the account of Aelius Spartianus, a 4th century contributor to the Historia Augusta. Spartianus paints a drastically different portrait of Karla than almost any other source I've come across, describing him as charming and clever, respectful and courteous, never lazy in his studies or hesitant to perform kind deeds. If he saw condemned criminals pitted against wild beasts, he wept or turned his eyes away. Once, when he was 7, hearing that a certain playmate of his had been severely beaten for adopting Judaism, he refused for a long time to look at either the boy's father or his own father, because he regarded them as responsible for the beating. But, Spartianus goes on, all this was in his boyhood. When he passed beyond the age of a boy, either by his father's advice or through natural shrewdness, he became more reserved and stern, and even more savage in expression. So much so that many were unable to believe that he was the same person whom they had known as a boy. Whether or not he was always a monster, it does seem like Karla and his brother were rivals from the very start. They managed to turn anything and everything into a competition between them, whether it was a cockfight or quail fight, a wrestling match or a chariot race. In one such moment, Karla is supposed to have whipped his horses into such a frenzy that he was thrown from his seat and broke his leg. Despite all that, their father naively clung to the hope that a bit of campaigning would turn his boys into comrades and eventually effective co-emperors.
What are you smiling for?
Nothing.
What?
The Disgusting Brothers on motherfucking tour.
Toward that end, this nuclear family proceeded to Britannia. Most of the island had been subdued under Claudius, and later famously fortified under Hadrian. Septimius advanced beyond his predecessor's border wall, determined to bring Caledonia, modern-day Scotland, to heel. But as he already suspected, Fortuna had other plans. By 211, the gout-ridden emperor was on his deathbed, having withdrawn to Eboracum, modern York, when the pain became too great. After summoning his sons to his bedside, he left them with one final piece of paternal advice. Be good to each other, enrich the army, and damn all the rest. This brings us to the burning question at last. What legacy was Septimius Severus really leaving behind? William Dunstan identifies 8 key points, which collectively qualify as the most extensive transformation of government since the reign of Augustus. There was the continued decline of the Roman Senate, the increased importance of the equestrian class, the heightened deification of the imperial family, the renewed reliance on the Praetorian Guard, the newfound reliance on provincial administrators, the large-scale building program, and a whole series of legal, military, and financial reforms, all of which we'll unpack throughout the course of this video. All things considered, Septimius Severus was a good emperor, says distinguished historian Adrian Goldsworthy, but he was also a man who had won power through military force and feared that someone else might follow his example. Perhaps the central irony of Septimius's life is that he had criticized his adoptive father, Marcus Aurelius, for naming Commodus as his heir, only to turn around and do the same thing with his sons. Somewhere along the way, though, Septimius probably realized that he really had no other choice. If he had picked somebody else, somebody who deserved the job but wasn't related to him, Karla and Gitta would have always remained a threat to his rule. Civil wars, assassinations, and coups would have been sure to follow. And so, in the spring of 211, the brothers were acclaimed co-emperors by the army, negotiated a ceasefire with the Caledonians, and departed from Eboracum with their father's cremated ashes. One has to wonder how they felt in this moment, now that it finally arrived. There's no doubting that both of them had yearned for it, so much so that Karla allegedly made 2 attempts on his father's life while in Britannia. "If you really want to kill me," his ailing father told him, "do it now with your sword. It would not be difficult." But if such a confrontation really did take place, then Karla evidently lost his nerve. The last time such a thing would happen. Immediately following his father's death, he ordered the execution of various members of his household. It was an ominous prelude of things to come, as divulged by a newly excavated cemetery in York. Back in Rome, a majestic funeral was organized, and the state occasion marked the only official act of the brothers' joint reign. Because the cremation had already taken place, the ashes were interred in a mausoleum, and a wax replica went on display for the next 7 days. It was only when physicians declared this replica dead that a funeral pyre was raised and set aflame. After being deposited in the sarcophagus, the wax emperor lay resting at the very summit of the pyre, where an eagle sat waiting to dispense its sacred duty. As the flames inched upwards, story by story, the onlookers must have watched in rapt anticipation as the eagle took flight with the soul of their emperor. Soon he'd ascend to godhood, joining the likes of Trajan, Hadrian, and Augustus. But not all the emperors in our story would be so fortunate. The Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from the Pillars of Hercules to the land between rivers, enclosing an area of roughly 2 million square miles, with a population between 50 to 60 million, perhaps 1/3 of all people on Earth. It sure was big, but it was not big enough for Karla and Gitta. Any hope their mother had of a reconciliation was dashed the moment they arrived in Rome. Having spent the entire journey from Caledonia either arguing or ignoring each other, the brother emperors now had separate posses, separate chariot teams, and separate palatial chambers, their hallways and doorways sealed up to prevent any awkward encounters. There was even talk of splitting the empire down the middle, right at Byzantium. Karla would get the west and rule from Rome, Gitta would get the east and rule from Antioch or Alexandria, and both sides would station troops on opposite shores of the Bosphorus Strait. Yet this was a fracture their mother did prevent, demanding to know how they planned to divide her since they were so eager to divide everything else. Some things, she knew, could not be divided without being destroyed. Such wisdom was not lost on Karla. Already he had seized the gold icon of Fortuna, which by tradition passed from one emperor to the next and accompanied every Augustus from the bedroom to the war room. Although Septimius had always intended to make a replica, in a poetic twist of fate, this otherwise active emperor never got around to doing so. This turned the issue of the statuette, much like the empire at large, into a fratricidal zero-sum game. By December of that year, the stakes were clear enough to warrant a kind of come to Jupiter session, a sit-down between a mother and her 2 sons at Karla's invitation. But as you probably guessed, this olive branch had a thorny underside. During the sit-down, Karla either killed Gitta by his own hand, or had a couple of his praetorians do the dirty work for him. It was among the most pitiable scenes in the whole of Roman history. As their contemporary Cassius Dio recounts, tricked in this way, Julia Domina beheld her son perishing by most unholy violence in her lap. She was all covered with blood, so that she made no account of the wound she had received in her hand. She alone, Augusta, wife of the emperor, mother of emperors, was not permitted to shed tears even in private over so great a calamity. With that, we are told, Karla leaves the room and makes a beeline for the Praetorian camp. Already he was shamelessly spinning the story to suit his grand ambitions, telling anyone who would listen that he had just survived an attempt on his life. "Rejoice, comrades," he told the guard, "for now I am in a position to do you favors." Convincing the Praetorians was easy enough, but now it was time to deal with the legionaries. It was only during the reign of Septimius Severus that a legion was stationed 20 miles from Rome, and so, with his father's deathbed counsel in mind, Karla set out to win this legion to his side. As another emperor once said, money does not stink, and it was money that did most of Karla's talking. Between all the donatives and pay raises, it sure was a hell of a time to be a legionary. Though the annual salary had already doubled from Commodus to Severus, it would soon be raised from 2,400 to 3,600 sesterci, perhaps 3 to 4 times what the average laborer raked in. After enriching the army, Karla finally explains himself to the Senate, invoking the name of Rome's founding father. "Indeed, Romulus, the founder of this city, refused to allow his brother to ridicule what he had done. So I too, when poisons were prepared for me and a sword hung over me, defended myself against my enemy. Jupiter, as he is himself, sole ruler of the gods, thus gives to one ruler sole charge of mankind." Here again, Karla was unconsciously ahead of his time, his talk of one god and one ruler sounding even more anachronistic than his conversations about partitioning the empire. All that would have been lost on a senatorial audience, of course, but the question that still remains is whether or not they bought it. Probably not, though at this point, it didn't really matter. Karla had come to the Curia with a military escort, and he looked as intimidating as ever. Herodian of Antioch recounts that, after making these statements at the top of his voice, in a towering rage, Karla glared balefully at his brother's friends and returned to the palace, leaving most of the senators pale and trembling. Then commenced his reign of terror, a witch hunt of witch hunts. This was a purge rivaling any of the prescriptions of the late Roman Republic, even those of Sulla and Augustus. Per Herodian, Geta's friends and associates were immediately butchered, together with those who lived in his half of the imperial palace. Not a single one was spared because of his age, not even the infants. Their bodies were placed in carts and taken out of the city. There they were piled up and burned or simply thrown in the ditch. Now add to those the corpses piling up in the provinces, and you arrive at a death toll like 20,000, the one that Cassius Dio reports. In true totalitarian fashion, no corner or class of the empire was safe. The emperor killed athletes, singers, and dancers, along with governors, senators, and vestal virgins. Sometimes he himself dispatched his victims, though far more often it was his henchmen, strangling someone here, staging a false flag operation there, and drawing on the full array not only of the imperial arsenal, but also the medicinal cabinet. Since the time that Galen praised his father for gathering so many remedies, Karla had stockpiled enough poisons to put the Borgias to shame. Gone was the boy who shied away from the Colosseum's violence, if indeed he ever had, for now the whole empire became his personal arena. He killed the famed jurist Papinian, and his only complaint was that an axe was used instead of a sword, making the execution a little too messy. He killed the son of his predecessor Pertinax for making a pun about Geta's death, at least 2 male descendants of Marcus Aurelius, and any other blood claimants he could get his hands on. He almost killed his tutor Chilo, but bowing to public opinion, spared him and decided to execute his would-be executioners instead. He had the wife he despised strangled, despite the fact she was already exiled. He had his adoptive aunt, daughter of Marcus Aurelius and mother to another of his victims, executed for no greater crime than mourning Geta's death. In meeting her end with dignity and grace, she showed the Severans what it truly meant to bear the name Antonine. Her famous last words, "Pining, unhappy soul of mine," shut in a vile body, make forth, be free, show them that you are Marcus's daughter, whether they will or no. Even the dead, however, were not to escape the emperor's wrath, and he got anything and everything related to Geta expunged from the public record. The Romans actually had a name for this procedure. It was called a damnatio memoriae, and because it prevented Geta from getting a proper funeral, it not only doomed him to irrelevance among the living, but also to exile among the dead. The long and short of it, I'm afraid, is that Karla was, in many ways, a bastard.
I'm afraid that in many ways the Romans were bastards.
Although there was some method to Karla's madness, some political reasons to act the way he did, on the whole, we're dealing with a clearly disturbed, clearly depraved personality. George C. Brauer describes his condition as follows. Although he carried his hatred for the dead Geta with him wherever he went, it was a strange thing. At times he seemed to see Geta before him, and at times he seemed to feel sorry about the murder. Something troubled him very much, and it would not let him alone. It may not have been a conscience, but whatever it was, it would not relent. Contemporary accounts, especially those of Dio, agree with this description. They tell us that Karla was ill in mind and body, that he was haunted by the ghosts of his kin, and that all the spirits he conjured up in his defense were silent, all of them except for Commodus. They tell us that while destroying Geta's memory, he was also poisoning the praetorians responsible for his death. They tell us that he became impotent, and that he tried to force himself on one of the 4 Vestal Virgins he later executed. To the very end, the maiden almost mockingly proclaimed her innocence, even as she was buried alive. They tell us that though he was the most adulterous of men, so far at least as he was physically able, he nonetheless punished adultery harshly, having one man executed simply for walking into a brothel with a coin that bore his likeness. They tell us that he was delighted to be called the Beast, even sending a million sestertii to someone who commented on his menacing appearance, which he had amplified in portraiture. They also tell us that more and more of his time was spent on chariot races and gladiator fights, the only places that offered him respite. While he was not as keen as Commodus to step inside the ring himself, he was a uniquely vicious spectator, forcing the gladiator Bato to fight 3 times in one day, and ultimately getting him killed. Unlike Commodus, says Adrian Goldsworthy, Karla was neither stupid nor lazy, but he was unpredictable and impatient, and, as we know, had a vicious temper. It was said that when the emperor finally got around to hearing petitions in the waning hours of the day, he was quick and canny in his rulings, though far less consistent than his father. Dio repeatedly spent hours waiting on the emperor, and even after doing so, he was often told to just come back another day. But a little credit where credit is due. It was during Karla's reign that Rome's largest set of baths, second only to the baths of Diocletian, were built and open to the public. Construction had begun under his father, and now that the complex was finished, it included gyms, libraries, courts, museums, theaters, and of course baths. The interesting part about those is that they enabled bathing at different temperatures, allowing for stoic Romans to take their daily cold plunge. In addition to the baths of Karla, there was his famous edict, which turned 30 million provincials into Roman citizens. We'll return to this edict and cover it in depth in the last chapter of this video. For now, we still have to get to know this second Romulus just a little bit better. Karla preferred soldiering to paperwork, despite the fact that he was a small and unhealthy individual. Because of his many health conditions, whatever they really were, he also made it a habit to visit as many healing sanctuaries as he could. All of this explains why he left Rome a year after his brother's death, never to return again. Regarding his departure, no one put it better than Edward Gibbon. It had hitherto been the peculiar felicity of the Romans, and in the worst of times the consolation, that the virtue of the emperors was active, and their vice indolent. The tyranny of Tiberius, Nero, and Domitian, who resided almost constantly at Rome, or in the adjacent, was confined to the senatorial and equestrian orders. But Karla was the common enemy of mankind. The rest of his reign was spent entirely in the provinces, first in those of the west and then in those of the east. By 213, Karla is in Gallia Narbonensis, and it is here that he got his nickname after adopting a modified version of the caraculus, a hooded Celtic cloak. It probably matched his straw-colored wig, which the prematurely balding emperor began to wear around this time. Despite his distant ancestry, he had been born in nearby Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, and he now gave the impression of feeling quite at home here. That is why Dio quipped that though he was allied to 3 different races, Karla got none of their virtues, but all of their vices. The lightness, the cowardice and recklessness of Gaul, the roughness and cruelty of Africa, the abominations of Syria. Yet the main reason for Karla's homecoming had to do with the arrival of an even wilder and more remote people from the dense woodlands of Germania. This is, in fact, the first time the Alemanni, or Allmen, appear in our sources. It's also one of few times that Karla seems to have been impressed by someone else's ferocity. The Alemanni were said to pull arrows out with their teeth so they could keep their hands free for the melee. Of their women, it was said that they preferred death to slavery, for themselves and their children alike. Nonetheless, the combined brutality of a tribal confederation was no match for that of a Roman emperor. And for the next 2 decades, the northern limes in Rhaetia would hold firm because of Karla's efforts. At this point, it's worth discussing the emperor's complex relationship with the army. Despite all he did to enrich the legions, there was still a lingering sense of distrust between Karla and his fighting men. Let us not forget that only recently, the army was pledged to not 1, but 2 emperors. By consequence, Karla chummed it up with his mounted bodyguards, the Singulares Augusti. These are mostly of Germanic stock, with a few Scythians sprinkled in. Karla called them his lions, and he ate, drank, and traveled with them, and promoted many to the post of centurion. On one occasion, Dio caught Karla personally serving them wine, all while he and other petitioners waited on the emperor as usual. To mend the breach with the rest of his army, Karla resorted to similar theatrics, proving himself at every turn a soldier emperor. He refused both the bath and the saddle, and marched alongside his men while bearing the weight of a legionary standard. If a ditch had to be dug anywhere, the emperor was the first man to dig, reports Herodian. If it were necessary to bridge a stream or pile up a high rampart, it was the same. In every task involving labor of hand or body, the emperor was first man to the job. He set a frugal table, and even went so far as to use wooden dishes at his meals. He ate the bread that was available, grinding with his own hands his personal ration of grain. He made a loaf, baked it in the ashes, and ate it. Leading by example is very well and good, but being a soldier and being a general are 2 very different things. Caesar and Alexander had been both. Karla, not so much. The details of generalship, in which he certainly ought to have been most versed, he managed least well, says Dio, as if he thought that victory lay in the performance of those services mentioned, and not in the science of commanding. This impulse toward play acting, today we'd call it LARPing, ultimately brings Karla to Asia, where, in the words of Napoleon, all great reputations are made. Between 214 to 215, the emperor crossed the Hellespont, visited Troy, and garlanded the tombs of various Iliadic heroes, thereby unlocking a new LARPable character in the form of Achilles. Soon he found a freedman to play the part of Patroclus, and this new imperial favorite was probably enjoying his role until he turned up dead, possibly poisoned. Standing before the funeral pyre, this balding emperor performed a pathetic impersonation of his great Homeric hero, cutting off what locks remained on his head and gingerly dropping them into the flames. Alexander, as in the Alexander, had once been a far greater Iliadic impersonator. That is why Karla now decided to LARP as Alexander. Many Romans had tried their hand at this role, most notably Pompey Magnus, but under Karla, Alexander Mania reached never-before-seen heights. Not only did the emperor dress like him, walk like him, and talk like him, he started hoarding Alexandrian memorabilia and commissioning statues and portraits of him in every corner of the empire. Some depicted Alexander alone, and others depicted a ludicrous, two-faced version incorporating Caracala's own likeness. The emperor sincerely began to believe that he was Alexander reincarnate, and he wrote to the Senate to inform them that the king walked the earth again as an Augustus. Unsurprisingly, given how conspiratorial Caracalla was, he bought into a prevailing theory that Alexander's tutor, Aristotle, was somehow involved in his death, making it awfully inconvenient to be a Stagirite stan. At the same time, the emperor gravitated to all things Macedonian, showing preferential treatment to those born with famous Hellenistic names. When he met a certain Antigonus, who had for a father a Philip, he made him an officer on the spot, and later a senator. On another occasion, he threw out a case because the defendant's name was, you guessed it, Alexander. Yet the most ludicrous of all these stunts was when Caracalla equipped thousands of his legionaries with out-of-date arms and armor, so he could organize them into a good old-fashioned Macedonian phalanx. It hardly mattered to this Alexandrophile that the legion had rendered this formation obsolete. He was too busy LARPing. By the summer of 215, Caracalla was in the city of Antioch, the third largest in the empire. Brauer calls it a sick and worm-eaten rose, but still a flower of overpowering gorgeousness. Here in Syria's provincial capital, the half-Syrian emperor did indeed stop to smell the roses. Gradually, he was diverting a greater and greater stream of responsibilities to his mother Julia Domna. She accompanied her peripatetic son the same way she had always accompanied her husband, and in this at least, Caracalla and Alexander really did have something in common. They both had extraordinary mothers. After Antioch, the imperial procession continued to its much-awaited climax, where else but Alexandria. With over 500,000 people, this was the empire's second largest city, the greatest by far of all the many Alexandrias. To describe what ensued, we can turn again to Brauer. For this capital of many races and many creeds, where men could go wild over a new concept or a new song, where clear Hellenic reason and wild emotion tangled, where Isis and the Virgin Mary sometimes coincided, where the populace could relax from fury by laughing at ridiculous emperors, Caracalla planned tremendous vengeance. He had been the butt of Alexandrian humor for a while now. They poked fun at his fratricide, his obsession with Alexander, and even his reconciliation with Julia Domna, who they preferred to call Jocasta, aka Mrs. Oedipus. None of that amused this cold totalitarian, which is why, after receiving the warmest of welcomes, he turned jeers into tears and a banquet into a bloodbath. Overseeing the slaughter from the Temple of Serapis, he offers in thanksgiving the sword that claimed his brother's life. Outside, the perfumed air is thick with smoke and blood, and garlands lie in the gutter, and all the gods are silent. It was without a doubt one of the foulest episodes of Caracalla's reign, the gloomiest start conceivable to a mild Egyptian winter. His unholy pilgrimage finally concluded with a visit to Alexander's tomb. There he discards his rings, his robe, his belt, and prays to the patron saint of greatness to be great himself. Undeserving though Caracalla was, it seemed he would get his big break only the following year. This time it was more than imitation for the sake of imitation. Caracalla aspired to marry a Persian bride so he could do the unthinkable, unite Parthia to Rome. Unfortunately for him, the King of Kings, Artabanus IV, saw right through his harebrained marriage scheme. Weak though he was ruling a shadow empire in its shadow years, he would never allow himself to just hand over the keys to his great Roman rival. That is why Caracalla boldly attempted to seize them, campaigning across Mesopotamia with some level of success. His father had made inroads in this region already, and Caracalla himself had by annexing the client state of Osrhoene, possibly through subterfuge. It was there, to Edessa, that the emperor now proceeded, celebrating his 29th birthday on the 4th of April, 217. By that age, Alexander was already in India, meaning Karla had a lot of catching up to do. In the end, though, he never got the chance, as only 4 days later, Karla was dead. Grim forebodings and vague premonitions preceded the death of Karla. His father appears in a vision. His pet lion, an actual lion, tears up his clothing. A man in Rome says there is no emperor but Jupiter. It was enough to get people talking, and then to start pointing fingers. At that time, emperors had the habit of naming 2 praetorian prefects, one for war and one for peace. During the reign of Karla, the second of these prefects was a man named McKeane, who Denzel will be playing in Gladiator 2. Self-made and crafty, his equestrian roots were also African, yet his ear piercing tells us that he was Berber rather than Phoenician. Already on one occasion, the childless Karla was warned that McKeane aimed to succeed him. Now there was a letter that not only confirmed this, but also warned of an imminent plot against his life. Though the plot was completely made up, McKeane, who was somehow tipped off, knew that if the emperor found out, the consequences would be very, very real. Fortunately for him, Karla had the habit of forwarding incoming letters to his mother, who essentially functioned as an imperial spam filter. Before she could CC her son, though, McKeane set a real plot into motion, more out of self-defense than naked ambition. Only one other conspirator was involved, a bodyguard named Martialis. His motive? Either to avenge an executed brother, or get back at the emperor for never promoting him to centurion. Marty's hit job was carried out on the road to Krai, while Karla was on the way to a healing sanctuary. After stopping on the side of the road to urinate, the emperor's lines all maintained a respectful distance, all of them except for Marty, who seized this chance to stab Karla in the back. He was then either killed on the spot, or a little while later, after reportedly failing to dispose of the murder weapon. Because McKeane's involvement was unconfirmed, it was he who became the next Roman emperor, the first in history to not come out of the senatorial class. He probably would have been pretty good at the job, though we'll never know for sure. That is because his reign was cut short by Julia Maesa, who became the Severin's new matriarch after the suicide of her sister. Having lost almost everybody she ever cared for, and possibly suffering from breast cancer, Julia Domna had taken her own life. A remarkable woman though she was, as a mother, she had forgiven the unforgivable. She had reconciled with Karla despite his murder of Geta, and basically ran his empire for him while he was out LARPing. The cold hard truth is that when it came to ruling, Julia Domna liked it and was good at it. And so, after her fall from grace, she saw no reason to go on despite the olive branch offered by McKeane. Ultimately, Julia Maesa proved just as able as her sister, securing the throne for her grandsons Elagabalus and Severus Alexander. These were the final 2 Severins to rule the Roman Empire, and though the events of their lives are also colorful in more ways than one, they're best saved for a future video. For now, we have to take this trireme to port, asking ourselves what it is that we just witnessed. If you're thinking, well, a bunch of fratricide, regicide, and homicide, you're on the right track. However, what all of this adds up to is the end of the Augustan template of rule. Already, there had been the year of 4 emperors in 69 AD, the year of 5 emperors in 193, and now there was the year of 6 emperors in 238. This marked the end of the House of Severus and the start of the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year procession of civil wars, assassinations, and coups. It was a time that made Tacitus trite, when the provinces chewed up and spat out an entire generation of Karlas. For some perspective, there were only 18 emperors in the first 2 centuries of imperial rule, whereas the 3rd century alone had more than 70. By the time Diocletian ends the crisis, imposes the dominate, and splits the empire up, we are dealing with a totally different beast. But it was during the reign of Karla that the metamorphosis had begun, as it was during his reign that everyone became a Roman. I've mentioned already that this was probably the largest citizen grant in history, 30 million people, mostly outside of Italy, joining the 30 or so million who were already Roman citizens. It meant that everyone in the empire, apart from newly freed slaves, could now call themselves Roman. Something like 1 in 3 people on the face of the planet at this time. So why did Karla do it? We know by now that this is not an emperor acting purely from the kindness of his heart or for the welfare of his people. Nor had this come from Julia Domna, since this was too big a decision to leave to her alone. The traditional explanation goes back to Cassius Dio, who reports that the emperor was simply interested in creating 30 million taxpayers. At first glance, this is a reasonable argument. Citizens were subject to the inheritance tax, and the empire was in a major deficit. Not only had Karla increased military spending, he maintained a costly building program not only in Rome with its enormous new bath complex, but also in the provinces. Septimius basically had the same expenditures, but unlike his son, he managed to balance the budget. After blowing through this surplus, Karla resorted to a dangerous monetary policy, reducing the gold content of the aureus and introducing the silver antoninanus, or double denarii. Both of these measures only contributed to a long inflationary cycle. All that said, the economy alone does not explain the edict. Karla needed money, yes, but the subsequent increase in tax revenue did not amount to much. Most new Romans were poor, and those who were better off, like senators, equestrians, and ex-legionaries, were already tax-paying citizens. Thus, we must turn to a second explanation, one given by Karla himself on a little papyrus scrap. On it, he writes that he is honoring the gods with the full majesty of the Roman people for guiding him through a dangerous conspiracy. In other words, Karla was buying himself forgiveness, salvation, legitimacy, whatever you want to call it really, by granting the gods 30 million citizens, a base of taxpayers for him and tribute bearers for them. We should take the explanation seriously for 2 reasons. First, because the grant follows so closely on the heels of Geta's murder, and secondly, because, like his father and everyone else at the time, Karla treated the gods, if not his fellow men, with reverence and respect. Even the great Alexander had done that, and unsurprisingly, it may also have been with Alexander in mind that Karla signed this edict. After all, by Romanizing his subjects, was he not doing what Alexander had done by Hellenizing his? The parallels are definitely there. Let's also not forget that the self-conscious Karla was a provincial himself. He knew it, the senators knew it, and to some degree the army did as well. That brings us to the last explanation, namely that the Edict of Karla was the logical endpoint of Rome's civilizing mission. What began with 2 legendary brothers and their band of robbers and refugees had matured from a city to a kingdom to a republic to an empire. That is why, whether we like it or not, Karla was, in more ways than one, a second Romulus, a role he lived rather than LARPed. But what about everybody else? What consequences did the edict have on the next generation of Romans? Well, for most of them, things didn't really change much at first, though already a bunch got a new name. Recall from earlier that Septimius had himself adopted by Marcus Aurelius. This in turn meant that Karla, whose name at birth was Lucius Septimius Bassianus, was renamed Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. And so, when Karla created 30 million new citizens, many of them took Aurelius as their nomen gentilicium, or family name. As far as consequences go, this one was harmless, even a bit endearing. The rest, I'm afraid, were pretty bad. Adrian Goldsworthy summed it up. Inevitably, with so many more citizens, the value of the franchise was lessened. The social divide between Romans and non-Romans was replaced by that of honestiores and humiliores, the honored versus the humble. This was a social change enshrined in Roman law, coinciding with a so-called Great Age of jurists and making everyone in the empire answerable to one legal system. In the past, all citizens had been protected from cruel and unusual punishments, but now humiliores might find themselves flogged, crucified, sent to labor camps, or even fed to wild beasts. Meanwhile, in the military sphere, There's a case to be made that the edict contributed to manpower shortages in the legions. Previously, the army had been the primary mechanism for creating new Romans. You served your stint in the legion, got your parcel of farmland, and became a citizen after you earned it. Now this incentive mechanism was gone, making pay raises and donatives some of the last carrots that emperors could dangle as barbarian hordes poured past the limes. The last consequence I'll discuss here today relates to that papyrus scrap I mentioned, the one regarding new worshippers. At first, the edict more or less had Caraclla's intended effect, elevating Roman gods and emperors as never before. Then, less than 40 years later, another edict was issued ordering Roman citizens to sacrifice to Roman gods. Though this was basically a crackdown on Christianity, it ironically set a precedent for its future adoption. After all, if a single set of gods could be agreed upon, then why not a single god? You can see where I'm going. As early as 330 AD, Rome got its first Christian emperor in the form of Constantine. By that point, every piece of the Second Roman millennium had more or less fallen into place. And yet this jigsaw puzzle goes back to 212 AD. That is why world-renowned classicist Mary Beard ends her account of the SPQR precisely at that point. The big question that had guided politics and debates for centuries about the boundary between the Romans and those they ruled had been answered. After 1,000 years, Rome's citizenship project had been completed, and a new era had begun. It was not an era of peaceful, multicultural equality, though. Citizenship, once granted to all, became irrelevant. What can we take away from this? I'm not sure, but what I do know is that 212 AD was a pretty important year. And while I don't think the Gladiator sequel even gets past 211, now you know what happens anyway. So go out with your friends, watch the movie, and resist the urge to correct everyone, most of all Ridley Scott.